From Tokyo to Washington, governments everywhere are borrowing money at a pace that is making a lot of investors, well, really, really nervous. It's a habit that's become so normal, so routine, that we barely even notice it anymore. And it's not just me saying this. Some of the sharpest minds in finance are pointing to this and saying, look, this is the single biggest issue we face. The sheer scale of it all, it's not just some minor problem on a balance sheet. It's grown into something absolutely massive. So, that brings us to the real heart of the matter, doesn't it? How on earth did we get here? What happens when this massive borrowing binge finally has to stop? And maybe the biggest question of all, who gets to decide when the party's over? Okay, first things first, let's really get our heads around the problem. And the diagnosis is pretty stark. The developed world is, for all intents and purposes, drowning in government IOUs. For developed countries, the average ratio of public debt to GDP has actually climbed all the way back to a level we haven't seen since 1945. Yeah, the end of World War II. Just let that sink in for a second. We are carrying wartime levels of debt, but we're in peacetime. That's something else. And this isn't just one or two countries having a bad run. No, this is a truly global thing. We're talking major economies. The US, Japan, France, even China. They're all carrying these historically massive levels of debt. It's almost become the new normal. So the big question is, how did this become a habit in the first place? Well, an addiction like this doesn't just happen overnight. It was really fueled by a pretty unique, perfect storm of circumstances. You have to remember, for a very, very long time, borrowing money was unbelievably cheap. We were living in this strange world of zero, sometimes even negative interest rates. And when money is essentially free, well, it is incredibly tempting to just keep taking on more and more debt. And then, bam, the shock started hitting. One crisis after another. You had the huge financial crash in '08, then the global pandemic, then war in Europe. Each time, governments had to step in and act as this insurer of last resort. And every single time, the solution was the same: borrow massive, eye-watering amounts of money. But here's the thing, that whole era of free money, it's over. Done. That huge inflation spike we saw after COVID forced central banks to jack up interest rates like crazy. And all of a sudden, just paying the interest on all that debt you've racked out became much, much more expensive. Now, this brings us to a really fascinating, almost mythical group of characters in the financial world, the so-called bond vigilantes. These are the market's enforcers, and believe me, politicians are terrified of them. So, who are these vigilantes? Well, it's not some formal club or anything. They're just investors. But when they lose faith in a government's ability to pay its bills, they start dumping that country's bonds. That selling pressure forces borrowing costs higher, which basically acts as a way to punish and discipline a reckless government. And if you want to see a perfect example of these vigilantes in action, oh boy, you don't have to look any further than the UK back in 2022. It was this wild moment that sent shockwaves through global finance, and it was a powerful lesson in what happens when you push the market just a little too far. It was like a lightning-fast chain reaction. Step 1, the government announces this huge plan for tax cuts that the market just did not believe was funded. Step 2, the vigilantes react instantly, selling UK bonds like there's no tomorrow. And step 3, the consequences. Borrowing costs and mortgage rates went through the roof, a financial crisis was brewing, and in the end, both the plan and the Prime Minister were gone, just like that. That dramatic collapse in the UK sent a really clear signal to every other government out there. And of course, it leads to the trillion-dollar question. The US is running these massive deficits with a debt path that, well, a lot of people think is totally unsustainable. So the big question is, when might the bond vigilantes turn their attention to the world's biggest economy? But what if this whole way of thinking about debt as this big, scary monster is just wrong? There's a really fierce debate going on among economists about this. Is all this government debt a looming crisis? Or is it actually a useful, even necessary economic tool? So you've basically got two opposing camps. The traditional view warns that too much debt is super dangerous. It risks what's called a debt death spiral, where you have to borrow just to pay the interest on your old borrowing. It also crowds out spending on important things like schools or hospitals. But then there's a whole other school of thought that says, no, you've got this all backwards. Economist Stephanie Kelton really sums up this alternative view perfectly. The core idea is that the government's red ink is our black ink. Its deficit spending is what actually creates financial savings and surpluses for households and businesses. So, by that logic, if you cut the government's deficit, you're literally taking money out of everyone else's pockets. They're just two sides of the very same coin. Okay, so with these two big conflicting ideas in mind, how does this whole story end? What is the end game for this global debt addiction? Well, the truth is, there are no easy cures here. None at all. If you look at the menu of options, it's pretty unappetizing. You've got deep spending cuts, known as austerity. That's always politically painful. You could try to let high inflation run for a while to burn off the value of the debt, but that really hurts savers. There's something called financial repression, where you basically force your own citizens to buy the debt. And then there's the nuclear option, default. Let's just say none of these are painless. But then you have Japan, a country that just seems to defy all the normal laws of economic gravity. It's been sustaining a mind-bogglingly huge debt load for decades, all without a major crisis. So what gives? So how have they pulled this off? Well, their central bank just keeps interest rates pinned down near zero. And here's the crucial part. Most of the debt is actually owned by its own citizens and companies. That makes Japan way less vulnerable to foreign investors getting spooked and pulling their money out all at once. The trade-off, though, it seems to be decades of pretty sluggish economic stagnation. This leads to another potential endgame, one that was actually used after World War II. And the strategy has a pretty dramatic name: assassinate the Vigilantes. It's simple, really. Governments, working with their central banks, can just override the market entirely, forcing interest rates to stay low no matter what inflation or deficits are doing. This whole strategy is known as financial repression. But ultimately, it doesn't matter which path a country chooses: austerity, inflation, or financial repression. There is simply no easy way out of this. There are no zero-cost solutions. Something has to give. The bill for decades and decades of borrowing is finally coming due, and someone, somewhere, is going to have to pay it. And all of this leaves us with one final, really challenging question. We know the addiction is real, we see it everywhere. But when you look at all the painful options on the table, you just have to ask yourself, could the cure for our global debt addiction actually be worse than the disease itself?